Okay, so in our previous segment, I mentioned that classes can hold two things. Data, now we've got that. So here's our student class. So we've got the data, we got the variables to hold the data. And classes can also contain functions. Well, what do these functions do? Well, they can do a variety of different things. They can help the class communicate with the outside world. They can help the class communicate with other classes. They can process and analyze data. They can do all sorts of things. But there is one function that every class needs, and that function is called a constructor. It's a special function. As the name implies, you use it to construct or create new students in this case, or new teachers if we were in our teacher class. So every class we need to create a constructor. Okay, so that constructor is going to interface with the outside world, and it's going to allow another part of our program to create new students with specific last name, first name, grade level, and student ID. Okay, so let's take a look at how we create a constructor function. Okay, so after I've created my variables, let's create our constructor function. So every constructor will follow this same pattern. We're going to start with a special keyword called public. Okay, this tells the compiler that the constructor function is going to be accessible from any part of our program or from any other program for that matter. It's a public function, which means that every other part of our program, including our main program, is going to be able to access it. Okay, then the name of the constructor is the name of the class itself. So in our case, student. Okay, so we put public student. The name of the constructor is always the same as the name of the class. Notice the capitalization. Okay, then I'm going to put some parentheses. Inside this parentheses is going to be a parameter list. Now let's come back to that later. And then I'm going to put open and close brackets. Inside those are going to be the code that constructs a student. Okay, now let's come back to this parentheses here, this parameter list. Okay, what is a parameter list? Well, when you call a function, you often want to give it additional information that the function can use to do its job. Now, in the case of our constructor, the information is going to need to be the specific last name, first name, grade level, and student ID of the student we want to create. Okay, so we got to tell the constructor the specific data that we want it to use to create the student. Okay, so we got to somehow pass in that data to the constructor, and the way we do it is through this so-called parameter list. So what I put in my parameter list is I list out a template for all the different pieces of data that I'm going to pass in, I'm going to give to the constructor function to do its job. Okay, so I've got to give it a string, which is going to be the last name of the student. Okay, so I'm going to list that first. So I put the variable type, just as if I were declaring a variable, string, and then I got to give it a name. Okay, so I'll call it new last name. Okay, just so I don't get confused with the last name variable here, which is the actual variable that's going to store the data in my student object. Okay, so I'll put new last name. Okay, then I'll put a comma. The next one I'm going to pass in is the first name. Okay, so I'll do something similar. I'll tell the compiler that I'm going to pass in a string to expect a string, and I'll name it new first name, just again, so I don't get confused with first name, the variable that I'm actually using to store that information. I'll put a comma. I'm going to pass in grade level. That's going to be an integer. I'll call it new grade level, just again, so I don't get confused with grade level, the variable that's actually going to store the data. And then last but not least, I'll pass in a student ID, so I'll call it new student ID. Okay, so inside the parentheses of your constructor is your parameter list. So you list out, it's as if you're declaring variables through which you're going to pass in this data from the outside world. Okay, so this is my parameter list. I'm going to have a string, new last name, string, new first name, integer, new grade level, and an integer, new student ID. Okay, so I'm ready to fill in the work of my constructor, the code for my constructor. So what does the constructor do? Well, it really, all it does in our case is it's going to initialize our variables. last name, first name, grade level, student ID. It's going to initialize those. It's going to set those equal to whatever you pass in from outside, from the outside world. So these variables that are in your parameter list. If you have a more complex scenario or application, your constructor can do a lot of different things. It can do anything that Java allows you to do. In our case, so all we're going to do is we're going to initialize our variables. So we're going to say our last name variable, which is actually going to store the data. We're going to set that equal to new last name. So the value that's passed in from the outside. Okay, we're going to set first name variable equal to new first name, the first name string that's passed in from the outside, and so on. So our grade level will be new grade level, and our student ID will be new student ID. Oops, I almost typed my own name. Now it seems like it doesn't do very much. All it does is initialize some variables. But this is enough to get us off the ground and to give us a base from which we can do more stuff. Okay, so here's our constructor function for our student class. All it does is it takes in information from the outside. So from outside this class, say from our main program class, this gives us kind of an interface to the student class. From the main class, we can now use this constructor function to create a student with some specific data and have that student store that data in these variables. And we can create a bunch of different students. We don't just use it for one student. We use this kind of like a template, like a cookie cutter that allows us to create a bunch of new students, each with its own set of specific data. Okay, so every class has to have a constructor. And in our case, that constructor, all it does is kind of just initialize some variables, but it can do a lot more as well. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we interface this back to the main program. So from our main program, how do we actually now use this constructor function to create some actual students? So let's take a look at that next.